So this week we continue our theme on liberating love. As I mentioned in my video for my Thursday update, my colleague Randy Partain describes love as an active commitment to the well-being of another. So today's service, we're going to hear stories about intentional love, choosing love in all of its complexity. As we mentioned a few Sundays ago, when Kathy and I were facilitating the service, we talked about how love is a verb and how love is a practice and how we need to be students of love. So sometimes we intentionally choose love in a complex or evolving relationships. We choose love knowing even when we're aware that it may not be reciprocated or that it pushes us out of our comfort zone. And today we have Anna and Pamela and Karen and Loris, who all agreed to share stories that demonstrate this type of choice, this type of intention.
I'm very lucky to be close with a number of my cousins on both sides of my family, especially 3 of my cousins on my paternal side. I think at least one of them is joining us from the East Coast. Unlike our parents' and grandparents' generations, none of us came from large family units. At most, we have one sibling, if that. But it's hard sometimes. We weren't necessarily close growing up, either in proximity or age or interests. We never gathered all together as a family for holiday celebrations or graduations. As adults, we've chosen to be close. We still don't all live near each other. Our age gaps have not changed. We have discovered our interests are actually more overlapping than we knew when younger. In spite of, or maybe because of all of that, we've made a commitment to one another to share in each other's joys and support one another through challenges. In 2019, one of these cousins, who was living in Brooklyn at the time, had a kid. I knew that I would most likely not be a real aunt, as defined in a genealogical family tree. Genealogical, not geological. Well, maybe there are aunts in geology, I don't know. So I was very eager to take on the honorary role for TJ. Shortly after she was born, Brooklyn had a measles outbreak, and TJ was too young to get that vaccine, so they had to remain inside. And then, when much of the family gathered in Florida with my grandmother, I was unable to make it. And then, in late fall of 2019, my brother died. My cousin and TJ were going to come to the service, but my cousin's maternal grandmother was dying at the same time as John's memorial service, so we missed each other again. In early 2020, Sam and I went on a trip, and then, you might be able to see where this is going, the pandemic came to the United States. My window to meet and hold this new precious life had closed for the foreseeable future. TJ is turning 5 this March. I've watched her grow up through photos and stories shared by family. I have seen her on virtual platforms and heard her voice through videos. I've sent presents and made her clothes as she's grown. But I have never held her hand or kissed the top of her head or read her a story as she sat in my lap. And still, when I think of her, my heart is filled.
It's a hard story to follow. My story is titled Love in the Time of Dementia. Loving my mom has not always been easy. Let me rephrase that. Loving my mom has often been uneasy. You see, when I was growing up, my mom abused me. She abused me both emotionally and physically. And you can't love someone who you're terrified of. But love her I did, finally, and I do, still. We worked and we therapied and we got past that, somehow. And by the time she was in older age, We had progressed so much that she was no longer just my mom. She was my best friend, too. I admired her. I admired her intellect, her wide-angled view of the world, her generosity, and not to mention she had a wicked sense of humor and an enviable ability to beat everyone at Scrabble. She was also an amazing baker and cook, and she shared that with everybody. That was part of her generosity. For Christmas, I remember she would make caramel rolls every year, and she would make scads of them, dozens of them, and hand them out to our neighbors and to other church members and to our family. She was just a generous soul. By the time she was in her low 70s, though, we were beginning to notice at times that she seemed not to be quite as sharp or as quick of thought. She was forgetting things. And she forgot sometimes people, too. But a reminder hastily offered seemed to deliver and dispel those momentary lapses. Still, a quick explanation here. Her mother and her father both had Alzheimer's. We watched her mother go from being very sharp and educated to, well, nearly being a child who wore diapers and forgot to know how to swallow even. She was in a memory care facility by then. And for a long time, my family had the practice that every Sunday after church, we would go fetch my grandmother and bring her home to my house for dinner and for an afternoon and evening. My mom made fajitas in the summer. We called that fajita season in my family. That was because that was the time when you ate fajitas, was when there was fresh tomatoes and peppers and onions and things. So we often had them. My grandma had had them with us many, many times. But after a while, she began to claim that she didn't know what they were. "What are these?" she would say. "How do you eat this?" This became to us the dimension tell. We knew then that if a member of the family forgot to know what fajitas were and how to eat them, that yeah, dimension had taken them in. We had to stop bringing her home. Not long after she forgot what fajitas are, she had also forgotten how to swallow. And she would just eat, and the food would drip down her face, and she would keep chewing and feeding her face. And at one point, she forgot more. She started to take down her pants in the middle of our living room to go to the bathroom. She had the urge, but she didn't know what to do with it. My grandmother became a shell. She resembled my grandmother, but wasn't any longer. She didn't know who she was, much less who anyone else was. So far, my mom still knew what fajitas were and how to eat them in the low 70s. And in 2016, my brother died unexpectedly. She lost a lot of ground then. She became more and more confused. Still, she did live at home with my dad, and she tried to kill herself twice. The first time she should have managed. She took 120 Percocet. She was terrified, you see, of losing her mind. She was terrified of being locked in a facility and maybe forgotten and left there. But she lived. She lived thanks to my dad, who had her resuscitated against her DNR while she was in the ED, because his love for her was not ready to say goodbye. Well, that made her very angry. She resented that she was still alive. She began to, at times, hate my father and demand a divorce and demand that she get to live alone. But you see, she couldn't live alone. She was past the point where she could take care of herself. So my dad had to live with her and try to keep her and still try to be happy with her. Well, she became more confused. She lost even more of her memory and more telling, more of her cognition. She wasn't just a sharp, quick-witted, she forgot things and people too, and we weren't able to remind her anymore. It was becoming obvious that my dad was not going to be able to care for her much longer because she couldn't be left alone, and he had to leave the house at times. It became very intentional, loving her, trying to remember to not get impatient when she forgot things or people, or at least trying not to let our voice belie that impatience when it happened. She forgot what fajitas are and how you eat them. She became mean and at times combative. Not only could my dad not leave her alone for fear that she would attempt suicide again, but he was becoming afraid of her herself and himself. He wasn't sure what she might do to him at night. She was incarcerated. She would approve of that term for that time in a memory care facility. I designed her room for her. She had a love of modern style and love of bright colors, especially yellow. So I found a couch in yellow and a small dresser in yellow. We went to IKEA and bought her a whole apartment full of new furniture, and other places too we went. Found little things to put around that would give her joy, we hoped. So my dad and his brother, my husband at the time, and I spent a day moving her into her new place, putting together all that IKEA furniture. And after that ordeal, we ordered pizzas for supper and had a small cake with her, hoping that in honor of her new apartment, she might be able to find a little bit of joy. It was a little false, though. We tried to sell it to her. We tried to tell her it was, her own place, just as she had been demanding that she could live in, just in her own place. But she knew it wasn't her choice. She knew that she was being locked in and what kind of place it really was. My dad visited her every day, sometimes twice a day. The whole time there, I think he missed once, and that was when the snowstorm made it impossible for him to get to her. I visited her every week on the weekends, and at least on the ones that I couldn't make, we made sure that somebody else was there too. She had a few friends who still came to see her. But more and more, she forgot who people were, and some of her friends started dropping off. Still, she knew who my dad was, and she knew who I was. We celebrated her first Christmas there by putting up a small tree and bringing gifts for her to unwrap. That was a disaster. She didn't understand what the gifts were. She didn't understand that you unwrap them. And when I tried to show her how to unwrap them, she became very upset and very agitated and kept trying to rewrap them while I was trying to unwrap them. It became apparent that Christmas was no longer something we could observe with her. Loving her got more difficult as she lost more and more of her memory and ability to think. She began telling stories that didn't make sense. She would just say things, and we would end up having to nod, yeah, mm-hmm. And sometimes we would try to carefully ask simple questions about what she was talking about, or we'd fill in the blanks a little bit with a noun or a pronoun, inserting whatever seemed appropriate or hoped that it was appropriate to her story at the time. It was like playing Mad Libs. We decided to take her out one evening. It was the one and only time we did that. She became very agitated and combative, and when we stopped in the parking lot of the restaurant, she turned around, took her cane, and hit me really hard on the legs. That hurt on more than one plane. It brought back a lot of what she had been to me. But I tried to keep that hurt and my anger and my fear out of my voice. We tried to coax her in, and she was not hearing any of it. At that point, she was not wanting to be anywhere near my father or myself. My ex-husband was there with us at the time, and he was able to coax her out of the car and into the restaurant. And we actually did have a fairly okay meal, went okay. But when we brought her back to the facility, she fought back and she refused to go in. We had to go in and get staff to help get her in. After a time, she did forget who we were too. What was important at that time, though, to me, was that I knew that she was my mom. I knew that she was one of my best friends. My mother had been extremely talented and drew and painted and sewed. She was kind of an interior designer. Now I was reading her Dr. Seuss stories. And she would make little simple crafts with the rest of the residents. That was something at one time she had jeered, and now she was pasting pasta on paper. This person did not resemble the mom that I had known. She didn't resemble the best friend who she had become to me. But I loved her still anyway, because I knew she was my mom. I knew she was still that woman that I had befriended. And she could forget, but I would not. She began to refuse to eat. I viewed this as her last-ditch effort to take back control of her life and how it could end. She was not far that into the disease yet that she should have been forgetting how to eat or wanting to eat. No, she was choosing not to eat. We had her entered into hospice care. It was obvious that she was probably not going to live a whole lot longer, but they gave her a good month or so. It seemed safe then as the last-minute trip that I was going to take with my husband to Europe, so we left. She was acting as she had been, a little weaker, but not nearing death, not yet. The day before we left, I went to visit her, and I found her and my dad listening to a musician playing the guitar and singing. And my mom joined in when she knew the song, belting it out. She always loved singing. She would have been a choir member here if she could have been. When I entered, she looked at me, and she knew me. I sat down next to her, and she grabbed and took my hand in hers, and she kept beaming at my face and telling me that she was glad I was here. When I had to go, I held out my arms, and she held her arms, and she hugged me goodbye. She died while I was away, a day before I returned home. I realized, though, that we had said our goodbyes before I left. That was a gift. I am, as I said, convinced that she chose not to eat. She did not want to become what her mother had, and so I whispered to her when I saw her laid out, "Go, Mom." It was hard knowing she was gone, but at that same time, I applauded her once again controlling her life, choosing to go before she became nothing but a shell, as her mother had. Go, Mom. Be in peace.
My name is Karen Wills. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member for my whole life as a UU and currently of First Universalist Church. But I joined a small group with Reverend Laura and Anna and Pamela, Karen at the time, and some other folks whom you heal for Lori. So we've been together for a little over a year, and it is such an enormous gift today to meet my friends, who I love, in 3 dimensions. There is a kind of love that my mother called pink clouds. She believed that everyone should have these pink clouds at least once in their life, and she had it a couple of times, but unfortunately not in her marriage most of the time. And when I was 21, my parents separated after an unhappy marriage together, and my father came out as openly gay, and something that the family had known for a long time. But he chose to live openly and authentically, and after a few years, he finally found his pink clouds. and repartnered with my other dad, Arthur, and they were together for 36 years. In 2015, I spent the last year of their lives with my dads, Frank and Arthur, when they both had developed incurable cancers. They had moved into a one-bedroom apartment where Arthur, who was no longer able to walk, was lounging like a queen, as he said, in the hospital bed, watching television and listening to music. And my father would sort of potter around, pruning his houseplants and rearranging his books, and supervising my sorting of the cartons and cartons of 36 years of papers that they had moved over from their old farmhouse into this two-room space. And we would drive down, my dad and I, to the beach at Herring Cove every evening, which is a Provincetown thing, and you drive to the beach and park and watch the sunset. Now, there was one night watching the sunset when my dad just sort of blurted out, "It is almost unbearable to sit and watch him die. I wish he would just get it over with." You're going to think I'm terrible. I'm terrible for saying that. And I said, it's terrible that you would be in a situation to have to feel that, and you love him so terribly. And there were funny times. So sometimes Frank wanted to get up and go shop at the A&P for their fish and their blueberries, but we had to go very early in the morning so the boys in town would not see how old and decrepit he looked. Now, Frank was 88, and Arthur was 90. And my dad, Frank, was still so vain that even though he had become quite deaf, he refused to consider getting hearing aids. So I got worried because sometimes when Frank was napping or had gone to sleep in the bedroom, Arthur might be calling out for a glass of water or knock the Kleenex off the table. And I got worried that Frank couldn't always hear him and respond. And I began to think, what if Arthur were dying in the middle of the night, and the nurses were away, and what if he was calling out for Frank, and Frank couldn't hear him? And I thought how terrible that would be. What a bad feeling for Arthur to have to, have that concern. And so I went to the True Value and researched my options, like a good Unitarian. And what I discovered is they had this thing called a Bluetooth doorbell, right? Battery operated, no installation, no wires. You get you set up the little device in one room with the buzzer, and then in the adjoining room is the alarm. And so I bought this thing, but I realized that the little small push button buzzer would be very difficult for Arthur to manage. So I took the top off of one of those Talenti Gelato things, nice little plastic jobby, and I affixed it to the door buzzer so that all you had to do was just bang on it a little bit with your wrist and it would raise the alarm. And I'm like, yes, and I brought it to them. And I felt so generous and creative and clever. And I brought them this thing. And my father, true to form, so we don't want that. Take that away. What is that? We don't need that. Get rid of it. And Arthur, always more gentle, said, I've known your father for a very long time. I usually know what he needs, and he knows what I need. Please, take it away. So I brought my magic doorbell back to the hardware store, and then I went for a very, very long walk on the beach, crying for them and for my unappreciated self. And finally, the ocean, right, will do this. Finally, it dawned on me that Arthur really was going to die sooner than Frank. And they knew that. He was ready to get it over with. They both were. Arthur did not want to alert anyone with a doorbell alarm. Frank really did not want to be in the room when the moment of dying was done. Arthur really did not want him to have to be. Secondly, it dawned on me not only that they both were ready for the dying to happen, unheralded, as quietly and as quickly as possible, but also that those two rooms and Frank's deafness were boundaries that they had chosen and set. An unspoken agreement that was a part of their relationship that I had no business trying to dissolve. I had grown up in a family where people spared each other almost nothing. But Frank had a relationship with Arthur which included sparing one another certain kinds of pain and preserving one another's dignity in ways that my childhood family had not honored. And so I began to understand that in order to love them as they needed to be loved, I had to back off and let them love one another in their own ways. I had to watch and listen and ask them what they needed, because as Arthur told me, they knew. And finally, I had to bear what was nearly unbearable. To love them enough to simply witness the ending of their days, easing the needs they named, without restlessly looking for something to fix.
And we change through love. We can't always predict or control how that happens. And we will always love imperfectly, which can be oh so frustrating or humorous, as Karen may reflect. But when we think about it, when we choose it, love can transcend age and time and distance and memory. When we act out of love, even if it's not quite right, or we're not remembered, or it's not reciprocated, we are better for it. And we find a sense of inner serenity.
I close our service today with Yes, We Can Talk by Mark Nepo. Having loved enough and lost enough, I am no longer searching, just opening. No longer trying to make sense of pain, but trying to be a soft and sturdy home in which real things can land. These are the irritations that rub into a pearl. So we can talk a while, but then we must listen. And the way rocks listen to the sea. And we can churn at all that goes wrong, but then we must lay down all distractions and water every living seed. And yes, on nights like tonight, I too feel alone, but seldom do I face it squarely enough to see that it is a door into the endless breath that has no breather, into the surf that human shells call God. It is time that we extinguish our chalice, both at home and in our MSUS worship space at the Fridley Community Center. We will share the words on the screen so all can join in reading it. Those of you at home will be muted, while those of you in person are encouraged to read aloud.